y'all. Today we're going to be covering section 5.8, which is the impacts of overfishing. The learning objective for today is that you're going to describe causes of and problems related to overfishing, and the suggested skill that you're going to practice is describing potential responses or approaches to environmental problems. So one of the vocab words that you should just know with this conversation is what a fisheries is. And fisheries are just going to be populations of fish that are used for commercial fishing. Another term is going to be fishery collapse. And fishery collapse is what happens when overfishing causes 90% of the population to decline in a specific fishery. So maybe the fishery we're looking at is tuna, and the fishery collapse would be if we lose 90% of that tuna population. Now, fishery collapse is obviously a big problem. One of the biggest problems being the fact that if we're losing 90% of the population, those populations may actually never recover from this collapse because of the fact that they have decreased biodiversity. So they're more susceptible to like pests and diseases, the inability to find mates because there's less of them, or inbreeding depression to where you're getting less and less healthy organisms from the offspring. And so fisheries collapse is something that we want to avoid because it can be a serious problem and can lead to extinction for that specific fisheries that we're talking about. Now, what it also does is when you are getting this fishery collapse, it decreases the genetic biodiversity of the fish populations, and then also the species diversity or the species biodiversity of the ocean ecosystem that they're a part of. So, for example, if you were to get a fishery collapse with tuna, you're going to decrease the genetic diversity in that tuna population, but it's also going to have impacts on the organisms that eat tuna or that interact with tuna or are prey of the tuna, and it's just going to cause cascading effects within the ecosystem. So when we see a fisheries collapse, it's never just going to be isolated to that one fish species. You're going to have to consider all of the ones that are connected to it. Now, there can also be economic consequences. Continuing with my tuna example, your fishermen are going to need the tuna because the consumers want it. And so if you get a fisheries collapse, it's going to be a loss of income for the fishermen. You're also going to get a loss of tourism dollars for communities. If people go to fish or to scuba dive and you're getting all this biodiversity crashing, then it's going to have economic consequences in addition to the environmental species consequences. So let's talk about a little bit like a specific example of this economic impact. So this right here, we're going to be looking at the New England 1975 to 2008 with some of the fish market that we're looking at. Now, between 1975 and 1985, it's going to be a period where we had overfishing, which is going to lead to this collapse that we see. And you're going to have a sharp loss of profits. Like this is going to be the amount of fish and the profits that they're having is the lines that we're seeing. And so when you have the overfishing, now all of a sudden you're getting the economic impacts of that. This is an example of tragedy of the commons. Since there was no incentive or penalty to prevent the overfishing from 1975 to 1985, we ended up having it overfished because it was a common resource and nobody was monitoring it. Excuse me. And so that is what we end up seeing here. Now, a random little fact, not specifically just related to this New England one, but subsidies is something that you might be asked about on the environmental science test, so I want to make sure that you know what it is. A subsidy is where the government is going to be giving money to help offset the costs of businesses. Now, governments actually commonly do this, where they are going to give money to fishing companies in order to help them be able to afford the price of being fishers. And then this is going to make it so that also their prices are lower for consumers. This helps to keep things affordable so that people can have fish to eat. But the problem is when the government's pumping money into helping these people have it be less expensive to fish, you're having more and more fishing companies. And then this is contributing to that tragedy of the commons and the overfishing. And so although subsidies can be a great thing, but subsidies can also sometimes lead to this tragedy of the commons. And it's something that we do see happening with fishing stocks and fisheries and the companies that are using them. So we're going to talk about some examples of ways that fishers might be getting their catch. And one of the examples that you need to know is bottom troweling. This is a really, really harmful fishing method that involves dragging a large net across the ocean floor, as you can see, like right here. It's a common way to especially get some of those grounds like flounders, like crabs, some of the things that might be living on the bottom of the ocean. Now, one of the problems, because it's a big net, is you get a lot of bycatch. And bycatch is going to be unintended species. This could be whales, dolphins, turtles, even the type of fish that you weren't trying to get. And so you're going to get a lot of this bycatch in the net because the net can't selectively pick. It's just going to be grabbing up everything in its way. What this also does is it's going to be stirring up ocean sediment, which causes more turbidity, the cloudiness of the water, which is going to be a problem for photosynthetic organisms. Also, just the fish getting through it, it's going to get in their gills, they're going to be consuming it. Not ideal. And then it's also going to destroy coral reef structures. If you have coral reefs on the bottom and you have a net that's just scraping along, it's going to breaking those off and killing them. So overall, this is going to lead to a decrease in biodiversity because it's killing non-target species. It's removing coral reef habitat. And it's just going to be detrimental to the ecosystems that these nets are going to be dragged through. So bottom troweling is an example here, and it's a really harmful one that's commonly used. Now here's going to be some other fishing practices that you might hear of. This first example, gill nets. This is not going to be the nets like bottom troweling where it's on the bottom. These are going to be floating within the water column, and it's ideally trying to get fish. So it's going to be going through, you're going to be catching up. You have a lot of the same issues. You're going to get a lot of that bycatch. You're going to get marine mammals, sharks, turtles, all of them can get entangled in the nets and can drown. The nets also pretty commonly break off or just get lost in the ocean. So then you have a bunch of these nets just floating. They're called like phantom nets, where they just float around and they can continue causing more and more problems, and nobody's monitoring them. So organisms continue getting stuck in them. Eventually they sink down, and it's just adding to the pollution in the ocean. Now, one thing to note is gill nets are illegal in some places. Not all places, though, and since the oceans are shared, with all the ocean currents, these nets end up all over the place when they're phantom nets, but they are illegal in some places. And this is going to be an example right here of what a gill net looks like. A lot of times it's buoys like holding it up, or it can be dragged behind a boat. Now we're going to have long line fishing. And this is where you're going to have a long line of baited hooks to catch fish. Now, when I say long line, usually we're talking like dozens of miles long. So very, 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 very long. Once again, you get lots of bycatch. You're catching things that aren't intended. Sharks are very commonly caught in this. It's also going to be harmful for birds. Birds will kind of swoop down because they see fish near the surface and they're going to get caught. And so you end up having birds dying from this. It's also kind of a less effective method when mammals are going to be stealing fish off the line. That's going to be a problem for not so much for the mammals that are getting them, but for the fishers who are trying to make money off of it. So that's going to be a consequence of it. And this is going to be an example here where you're going to have, sometimes it's behind a boat, but a lot of times it's going to be on buoys. You've got this long line with all these baits, and then they're going to go and have the fish caught by it. So here's going to be kind of the long-term consequences of what can happen when we are depleting some of these fisheries. So as we deplete the large predatory fisheries, we're going to have to start moving down to smaller fish species. So for example, these are typically going to be ones that we're going after, like salmon, tuna, sturgeon, rockfish. These are the ones that people often are eating in restaurants. So if we get to a point where those are collapsing, we're using them up, fishers still have to make a living. They still need to go and get fish, and people's diets are just going to have to change a bit. So we're going to have to start going for some of these smaller fish like herring, sardines, anchovies, stuff like that. Now, as of right now, those are decently plentiful in the ocean. But if all of a sudden we have to start going for these, then those become at risk for depletion. And as we're going to get these depleted, one of the things that happens is these bigger fish eat these fish. So if we move down the food web and we start eating these larger fish are never going to be able to recover because they now have lost the food that would have helped them recover. You're also going to start getting the marine mammals and the seabirds and all the animals that eat these are going to decline. So once again, we're talking about whole ecosystems when we have fisheries collapsing. And as we just kind of keep moving from species to species, once again, the whole ecosystem is going to be impacted. Now, with food webs, we're then going to go and see some of the prey are going to increase, some of your like zooplankton and jellyfish and stuff like that. And then phytoplankton, which creates 70% of oxygen on planet Earth and are going to be kind of the base of the food web in ocean ecosystems. Phytoplankton are now going to go down because the zooplankton that eat them go up, and we just start to get that trophic cascade where it just cascades down from level to level and can wreak havoc on the whole ecosystem if we don't make major changes where we're not just continuing to go and just deplete over and over different populations. So here's going to be some of our options for sustainable fishing practices. One of the things that we can do is we can have quotas. This is going to be where the agency that is in charge of the fishing permits can restrict fishing companies to only harvesting a certain amount of fish in a period of time, and they monitor these to make sure. This is something that we do with like deer hunting, where they're going to have quotas. You can only take a certain amount. You can also have laws passed to prevent overfishing, and that's just very broad, but it is something that governments can do. Another thing that governments can do is protected marine areas. These are going to be areas where fishing and other human activities are either totally banned or they're limited to protect biodiversity. Now, some economic benefits that can come from that is that it can be really good for tourism. People want to go and scuba dive and snorkel in areas where fish are plentiful. It gives these organisms places where they can go to recover, to be safe, and it kind of can be like a protected sanctuary area. And this is also really good for scientific research, areas where we're getting as natural as possible of ecosystems. And so you're going to have scientists being able to study organisms in those areas, kind of test ecosystems, see how they respond to certain things. And so protected marine areas are often where you're going to find like research labs. And again, tourism, people like to go there. All right, so this is going to be a practice FRQ for 5.8, where you're practicing the skill of describing potential responses or approaches to environmental problems. So I know that we just talked about some examples, but maybe go a little bit in depth into the idea of propose a solution to address the issue of fishery depletion. So that's going to be a practice FRQ for 5.8. Those were going to be your notes on 5.8 about fishing practices.